Tom Riddle, his first year in Hogwarts. Chapter 1, Prologue. Tom stood by the window of his small, sparsely furnished room in the orphanage, gazing out at the dreary sky outside. The dull gray clouds seemed to mirror the gloom that had settled over his life ever since his parents had left him in this cold, unfeeling place. He absently traced the tender bruises on his arms, souvenirs from another brutal encounter with the older boys at the orphanage, including the particularly cruel Billy. A cold, calculating smile crept onto Tom's pale lips as he remembered the satisfying thud he had heard when Billy had accidentally fallen off the roof of the garden shed. It seemed that for once, justice had been served. The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor outside his room snapped Tom out of his dark reverie. He quickly wiped the smile from his face, replacing it with the blank, emotionless mask he had learned to wear around the overbearing matron and her minions. The footsteps stopped outside his door, followed by a sharp knock. "Tom, time for lunch," barked the matron's shrill voice. "Coming, ma'am," Tom replied obediently, his voice devoid of emotion. He quickly smoothed out his rumpled shirt and straightened his ill-fitting trousers before making his way to the dining hall. The dining hall was as cheerless and institutional as the rest of the orphanage, with its drab gray walls, long, battered wooden tables, and uncomfortable benches. The air was thick with the smell of overcooked cabbage and boiled potatoes, a far cry from the delicious aromas that wafted from the kitchens of the grand manor houses that dotted the countryside outside the orphanage's dingy walls. Tom took his usual seat at the end of one of the long tables, farthest from the head where the matron sat, surveying her charges with an eagle-like gaze. The other children, a motley collection of unwanted and forgotten souls like himself, avoided eye contact with him as much as they did with the matron. It was safer that way for all involved. As the meal progressed, the whispers and hushed conversations among the other orphans caught Tom's keen ears. It seemed that his accidental mishap with Billy had not gone unnoticed, and a few of the bolder children were even sharing furtive grins and congratulatory nudges in his direction. Tom kept his expression neutral, revealing none of the satisfaction he felt at the news of his tormentor's misfortune. The matron's harsh voice cut through the din of the dining hall. "Riddle, come here, boy!" Tom slowly rose from his seat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he made his way towards her. He didn't like being singled out, but he couldn't afford to show any defiance. Not yet. "What is it, ma'am?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, offering no clue of his internal thoughts. "There's a visitor for you," she said, her thin lips twisting into what passed for a smile. It was a patronizing gesture, filled with pity, that Tom loathed. "An elderly gentleman, he's waiting in your room." A visitor? Tom's mind raced. He couldn't remember ever having a visitor. No one ever came looking for him. His parents were gone, vanished from his life years ago. He had no other family. This had to be a mistake. "In my room, ma'am?" Tom repeated, making sure his face showed that he was both perplexed and a little discomfited. "Yes, your room," she confirmed impatiently. "Now go on, and try to be polite. The gentleman seems to be waiting." The matron's words held subtle expectations, as Tom understood she wanted him to behave and not cause any trouble with the visitor. Tom approached his small, Spartan room with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. He had never received a visitor in all his years at the orphanage, and the idea of an elderly gentleman waiting for him in his private quarters was both intriguing and unsettling. The matron's words echoed in his mind, urging him to be polite and not cause any trouble. It was a familiar refrain, one he had heard countless times before, but today it felt heavier, more significant. He hesitated for a moment outside the door, gathering his thoughts and composing his expression into the blank mask he wore so well. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only light filtering in through the grime-streaked window overlooking the drab orphanage courtyard. The air smelled musty, a mixture of old wood and the lingering scent of the cheap, harsh soap the orphans were issued for their weekly baths. Tom's sparse belongings were neatly arranged on a small, rickety dresser. A few threadbare shirts, a pair of ill-fitting trousers, and a battered leather satchel that held his most treasured possession, a worn, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. It was the only connection he had to his mother, a reminder of a happier, more carefree life that felt like a distant dream. In the corner of the room, perched on the edge of Tom's narrow cot, sat an elderly man dressed in a well-tailored suit that seemed out of place in the drab surroundings. He was leaning forward, examining the crude drawings of snakes that adorned the otherwise bare walls. The man looked up as Tom entered, and their eyes met for the briefest of moments. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine as he caught a glimpse of the man's eyes. They were a piercing, icy blue, the likes of which he had never seen before. "Come in, Tom," the man said, his voice deep and measured, with a hint of warmth that belied his stern appearance. "Please have a seat." He gestured to the empty space beside him on the narrow bed. Tom hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. The man's polite demeanor was at odds with the harsh discipline he was accustomed to at the orphanage, and it left him feeling unbalanced, unsure of how to react. "Go on, Tom," the man urged, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I assure you I mean no harm." Taking a deep breath, Tom tentatively approached the bed and lowered himself onto the worn blanket beside the stranger. He sat with his back straight, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the man's weathered face. "My name is Albus Dumbledore," the man said, extending a long, slender hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Tom." Tom hesitated for a moment before tentatively reaching out and shaking the man's hand. The grip was firm but not overbearing, and there was a strange warmth emanating from the man's touch that Tom couldn't quite explain. "I've come a long way to see you, Tom," Dumbledore continued, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "You see, I have something important to tell you, something that I believe will change your life in ways you cannot yet imagine." Tom's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension swirl in his stomach. Who was this strange, well-dressed man, and what could he possibly know about him? And what secret could be so important that it would warrant such a mysterious visit? "What is it, sir?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need to tell me?" Tom sat on the edge of his bed, his heart pounding in his chest as he studied the enigmatic man before him. Albus Dumbledore seemed to sense his unease, for he offered a reassuring smile before speaking again. "Tom, I'm here because I have reason to believe that you've experienced certain occurrences in your life that cannot be explained by logic alone." Tom's mind raced back to the incidents he had tried so hard to forget. The time he had caused a bully's nose to bleed without touching him, or the time when a girl who had teased him about his clothes had tripped and twisted her ankle. He had never told anyone about those moments, not even the orphanage matron. They seemed like the stuff of nightmares, or something else entirely. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. I don't know what you mean, sir." Dumbledore's eyes, those piercing blue orbs, seemed to bore into Tom's very soul. The old man's next words confirmed what Tom had feared. "Tom, I know you are hiding something. I can see it in your eyes. You have a gift, a very rare and special gift, one that I believe you've been trying to hide from the world." Tom's heart thudded in his chest, and he felt beads of sweat break out on his forehead. He couldn't deny it any longer. This stranger, this Albus Dumbledore, knew the truth about him. What do you mean, sir?" he managed to croak out. Dumbledore leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tom, I mean to say that you are a wizard." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and wonder. A wizard? Tom had heard of such things in the stories he'd read, but to think that he, an orphan boy with nothing to his name, could be one of those mythical figures was beyond comprehension. But that's impossible," he stammered, shaking his head in denial. "Wizards aren't real. They're just stories to scare children." Tom stared at Albus, his breath catching in his throat. A wizard? It couldn't be. It was some kind of cruel joke, a prank orchestrated by the matron or one of the older boys. But the look in Albus's eyes, the quiet conviction in his voice, told him this was no jest. Before Tom could form a coherent response, a searing heat filled the small room. A crackling orange glow burst from within his simple wooden wardrobe. Flames danced and writhed, consuming his meager collection of clothes and the few other personal belongings he kept inside. But strangely, the fire didn't spread. It was contained as if trapped within an invisible barrier, casting an eerie light on the room. Tom recoiled in shock, his mind struggling to process the impossible. He had never seen anything like it. Yet, Albus remained perfectly calm, observing the spectacle with an almost clinical detachment. The fire sputtered, diminished, and then vanished entirely, leaving behind no scorch marks, no lingering scent of smoke. His wardrobe stood untouched, as if the fiery display had never happened. Albus turned to Tom, his blue eyes holding a mixture of concern and understanding. "You see, Tom," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is the power I spoke of. It is a part of you whether you like it or not, but it is raw, untamed, and it needs to be controlled." "How?" Tom whispered, still reeling from the sudden eruption. "That is precisely why I am here," Albus replied. "I am here to tell you that you will be coming with me. I'll take you to Hogwarts. It is the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in the world. There you will learn to understand and master your abilities. It's paramount that you learn to control them. It's a place where young witches and wizards, like yourself, are taught to harness their magic." Tom stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Hogwarts, a school for wizards. Leaving the orphanage. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. He thought of the bullies, the endless chores, and the despairing monotony of his daily life. Then he thought of the power within him, the mysterious force that had manifested itself in both terrifying and subtle ways throughout his life. He looked at the wardrobe, now devoid of any sign of the fiery upheaval, then at Albus. A hard, defiant glint appeared in his eyes. This was the escape he had always longed for. Tom nodded, masking his eagerness with a carefully constructed expression of polite compliance. "Very well, sir," he said, the words barely more than a breath. "I'll go with you."